Welcome everybody. Thanks for joining me. We're going to do the old Ask the Stud number 2 here. And this one I think is going to be just as good, maybe even better than the first one. I mean, the questions are just unbelievable. And I want to thank everybody that has sent me all these great compliments and these comments about the first one. And I knew this would be a popular show. I really enjoyed it myself. I love doing these question and answer shows. And I thank all of you for all your comments and everything. And we're going to give you a good one again today. Hopefully we're going to get somewhere around an hour, answer as many questions as we can in the next hour. And hope you're going to enjoy this, and I hope you come back again. Don't forget to look for them every month. Third Saturday in the month, and we're going to keep coming at you with them, and the next one is going to come in March, the third Saturday in March. And let's jump right into this one.
Our first question comes from Shane Hatfield, Kansas City, Missouri. As an effeminate wrestler working in the South in the 80s, Adrian Street was a natural heel. Though tough as nails, he portrayed a complete opposite of everything fans considered manly. Whose idea was it to turn him babyface? Were there any worries that things could backfire? Why do you think the fans were accepting of him as a hero, even though the rest of his persona stayed pretty much the same as when he was a heel?
That's a great question. Wow. The gentleman from Kansas City, I think, right? Kansas City, man. A great wrestling city. Wow, wrestled there. It's a good place to work. Adrian Street was he was one of the strangest individuals, man, that probably ever booked. And he was so phenomenal. To me, he was so phenomenal, and I would have never brought him in. His angle and his gimmick was so strange that if he hadn't been a shooter and a great wrestler, and I saw that right away, first time I ever watched a video of him, it didn't take me 3 minutes to go, this guy can wrestle. And so that kind of intrigued me, and then to have that kind of gimmick was something else. And he was a great heel. Wow, for probably 3 years, close to 3 years with Continental. He came in about the time Continental was cranking up. And he worked with all the great baby faces we had. We had some great guys for him to work with, Wendell Cooley and Dr. Tom Pritchard, and wow, just a list of them. The Armstrong boys, it was amazing. All the great baby faces we had to put him with, and he did some crazy things. He won the Southeastern Championship. He took the belt, and he asked me about it. He said, "Ron, I want to paint the belt pink." And I went, "Well, geez, man," And I got to thinking about it, and boy, it fit his character, So, and he got more heat with that pink Southeastern belt than I could have ever anticipated. He was just really, really fantastic. And I think your question was, sir, about turning him, if a heel is really great, and Adrian was, geez, he had it all. He was great on the mic. He was tremendous in the ring. He worked his gimmick so well. And Linda, his wife now, they're married, and she was just phenomenal. She was great and could wrestle herself, so we were able to do a whole lot of things with those two. But his gimmick was so great that, and he got such heat that when you turn somebody, you got to make sure that. And turning him was my idea, and he had never been a babyface before. He didn't really know about it either. It's kind of similar to Bob Armstrong. The first time that Bob ever turned heel, he was really concerned about, wow, is this going to kill me off? And it's got to get over or I'm dead, And wow, he was anything but dead. He was just phenomenal as a heel. And Adrian, when it turned him babyface, was just phenomenal as a babyface. He did a really great job, Linda was great. He has a babyface, valet. Whole thing worked really, really good. When you turn somebody, you really don't know until you do it whether it's going to work or not. So you have to put a whole lot of thought into it. You don't want to do something that you really don't prepare for. You got to kind of set a heel up to start the change before you actually do the change. A lot of times, you let him start to be less successful. You start to beat him more. His attitude changes a little bit. You kind of prep people for what may happen or what's going to happen. And I think that's what we did with Adrian when we did his turn. But with Bob Armstrong, they never saw that coming at all. And they never imagined that was going to happen. We did it in a one-night thing. He just went from being a tremendous baby face to a really monstrous heel in one match, one night. So that was very different. Adrian, one of the greatest of all time, in my opinion, great shooter. Honestly, really knew how to shoot. Jesus. I had an Adrian Street as one of the stars of the sport that's not up there yet on the channel, on the streaming channel, but there is one with Adrian, and it is amazing. That his history is truly amazing, especially his European history. And I encourage people to go and take a look at it. It is on now on the Tennessee Stud, tnstud.com, on my website, and it's a super studcast, Adrian Street. Wow, it's really great. You're going to learn some things that you never imagined. Wow, and the things he did. He was such a tremendous star in Europe. He was a Hollywood actor almost. He is that big and that strong in Europe. And he came to us, and we were the first place he came to in America. And wow, he just really, really got over. And thanks. That's a great question, sir. Adrian Street is a phenomenal character and a tremendous guy. Really, really enjoyed being around Adrian Street. A great personality, a very upbeat person. And I think he's now about 80 years old. And if you get a chance to maybe Google him, you'll find out a lot more about him and what he's like today. He has still got the best body that I've ever seen for anybody his age, and he's still in the gym. Tremendous person, tremendous guy, great question, and thank you very much for it.
Our next question is from Todd Flynn in Cerebreville, Tennessee. How long was the third New Guinea Headhunter, managed by Kevin Sullivan, hidden underneath the ring in the famous cage match between you and Robert against the team?
That's a good one too, Todd. That's a good question. I guess to set this up, I need to go back and talk a little bit about the Headhunters and Kevin Sullivan. For those that maybe aren't aware of this, this was during Continental's days. I'd say this is probably around 1986. Kevin Sullivan came in as a manager, and he had two guys from New Guinea. Wow. That was a great little gimmick that we really had going there. They wore the old straw leggings from their knees down, and they brought the tiki torches that were on fire, and Kevin was following them or leading them from the dressing room, and wow, they got over this tremendous. Wow, we call them New Guinea Headhunters. They had some unique moves. They did a whole lot of things that kind of fit with somebody from that part of the world. So we had all kinds of matches with them, me and Rob at the time. All the different types of tag matches. Probably we went along about 3 months with them, and so we finally got to a point where we had to have a special type of match. We had to figure something different, something that we had never done. And so we we booked it in a cage match. Me and Robert against the Headhunters, and Kevin Sullivan on the outside of the ring, obviously. He was their manager. And and I'd always, we'd done cage matches, and so did everybody else in the country do cage matches, but I'd always wanted to do something that had never been done, and when you did that, the word kind of got around to other territories, and this probably got done, no telling how many times after we did it, but we were the first ones to ever do it. And so I said, well, Rob, and I said, what can we do that's really different? And so we came up with an idea that it was absolutely awesome. So we decided that, and they had a third guy, and we had never used him. There was a third headhunter, and he came, he was living with those guys, Kevin and the two boys that were the headhunters there. And the third one was living there, but we had never used him. So we decided in the cage to put him underneath the ring and have him come up through the ring, cut his way out from underneath the ring and come up through the ring and end up with the three headhunters against me and Rob in the cage. Obviously, then they beat the hell out of us. But it was just unbelievable. And I think your question was, how long was they under there, this guy under that ring before he got to come out? And matches started, we did this, it was on TV. And we opened up the building in Birmingham usually about 6:30, and matches started at 8:30. So he went under the ring about 6 o'clock. Nobody in the building at all. The television crew was setting up, but they kind of knew what was going on. But and they didn't pay any attention to it. So he slid underneath the room. It had an apron around the ring, so you couldn't see what was underneath the ring. And so when they put the cage up, then me and Rob got in the cage. Two headhunters got in the cage. They locked Kevin on the outside of the cage, and we began the match. And toward the end of the match, Rob and I were pretty much beating the heck out of him, and we were about to win the match. And all of a sudden, we had this guy down below, and he had a big, long butcher knife. Had a blade. It was about that long. And you could find the ring was made with steel runners that went across, was about every 3 feet apart or whatever, and then the plywood laid on top of that. So he found the split between the two sheets of plywood toward the middle of the ring, and he jammed that knife up through the mat. Wow, and it was a fairly new mat. I mean, those mats were about $500 each. It was kind of an expensive way to work a gimmick, but wow, what it did was just phenomenal. But anyway, he shoved the knife up through there, and he started cutting down the plywood. And I remember that when me and Rob were just kicking their butts, and the place is going crazy, man. You can't hear yourself scream to somebody 2 feet away. You can't hear what they say. And this knife comes up through the ring. And when it came up, this building, and like almost everybody saw it at the same time, and they went from screaming like to dead silence. And that knife was kind of making its way across the ring. And me and Rob are still not paying any attention to what's going on. We're still kicking our butts, but the building's gone from standing up to all the mouths are all open everywhere. What in the heck is this? And then all of a sudden the guy's underneath. He had to push the plywood up. He got his hands up through the mat, and he tore the mat back, shoved the plywood up, and came between the steel railings and pushed the plywood up enough that he came up inside the ring. All of a sudden, there's three headhunters against the two of us, me and Rob. Oh, wow. Another great finish. I mean, fans were just astounded, how in the world did this happen? And so then when they opened the cage, After, the third guy came up, referees kind of trying to stop the match, but, in a match like a cage, referee usually got knocked down and he was kind of out of it anyway. He got slipped off to the side. Finally, somebody was able to get a key and they unlocked the cage. When they did, Kevin came in the cage. And that made 4 on 2 and just made it even more heat. Tremendous heat, man. They finally all 4 got out. Me and Rob both bleeding and laying there. Referees down. The mats all torn back, and there's a piece of plywood hanging out, laying on the mat. It was a pretty awesome scene, and it was one of those finishes, man, that had never been done. It had never, ever been done. And I have a feeling that finish probably got done, and no telling how many places around the wrestling world, because it was so unique, and it just absolutely astounded the fans. It was a head shaker, man. And so he was down there basically for about from around 6:30 up till about probably 10 o'clock at least. He's down there 3.5 hours, close to 4 hours probably, before he came out from underneath the ring. People had no idea there was anybody there. And it had to be a horrible experience for him. I mean, that ring was really loud. All of our rings were made out of steel and they made a lot of noise. And, all those slams and all those matches before this last match, the cage match, had made a lot of noise for him down there. And But what a great match. And thank you very much for bringing that up, Todd. That was really one of the best finishes we ever did.
Our next question comes from Melissa Tillery from Troy, Alabama. What's the one wrestling question you would ask your grandfather, Roy Welch, if he were still here?
Well, I know Melissa pretty well. She's a great fan. I've been a fan for 30, 40 years. So it goes way back. But that's a great question, Melissa. I mean, I had never really thought about it. I asked my granddad so many questions. I had the opportunity. He used to go to Memphis he had a big dairy in Yorkville, Tennessee. And it was about 80 miles to Memphis. And he'd figure out a way to get rid of Rob and Jimmy. He'd shoot them with BB guns or do crazy stuff to them till they ran off. And then he'd get me in the car and he'd take me with him to Memphis. And I had the opportunity to ask him all kinds of questions. And this, I guess, the great answer to your question here, Melissa, is I was intrigued. I was totally intrigued by his bear. Roy had trained one of the first wrestling bears in the late 1930s. Her name was Ginger, and he took her everywhere. And and I asked him, I asked him about how did you get the bear, and he told me a story about wrestling in West Virginia. And just him in the car by himself made a trip from Knoxville, Tennessee to West Virginia, 2-lane roads. I asked him, how long did that take? It's like a 13-hour trip, one way. And so he said on the way back that he came upon a bear that had been hit by a car. And she had a cub. And he said that she was laying in the road. And he said that he almost ran over her. But, and she was dead, and she'd been hit probably with a great speed and whatever. And he said the bear, the little cub, was just kind of staying with her body, he wasn't, and Roy said, I got to thinking that, there's going to be a car come by here and ain't going to be watching like I was, and, and that little cub's there, and wow, he's going to get that cub killed. And so he said he opened his trunk and he had a big Cadillac. He opened his trunk and he put the bear cub in his trunk. And he saved the bear cub's life, obviously, no telling how that little cub would have died otherwise. So he took this bear cub home and he fed him with a regular bottle of milk like you would give a baby. Until the bear got to be grown. And then once the bear got to be grown, This was in the late 1930s, and the war started. World War II started, and he wrestling was going to be kind of dead. All the men in the country were at war. They were either working in factories or they were in Europe or Japan, in the East, they were all over the world, but they weren't home, and there was no normal life. So he said that he got the idea to train the bear to wrestle because she was very, very tame. He was her father, and she just loved him. And so he was able to, he never pulled her claws out like they did bears after this time frame. And they pulled out their eye teeth so they couldn't bite anybody and they couldn't scratch anybody. He did not do that to his bear because he could make her do what he wanted to. And she minded him. So he would put these mittens on her feet, and he would put a mask on her face that kept her from biting, because he didn't want to get a wrestler hurt. And he took her because it was the beginning of World War II, and there was no other place to go, and you had to have something truly unique to be able to draw a big crowd of fans at this point. He took one of the first wrestling bears ever, Ginger, on a North American tour. He took her, put her in a trailer, and he took her into Mexico. He took her up the West Coast, into Canada, and he traveled just about, he said, through 40 of the 50 states. Wasn't 50 states even at that time. Way back in that time, it was fewer than 50. But he took her all over North America. Stayed on the road for almost 3 years. And when he came home, he kept the bear. Then he started using her in his own territory. He wrestled the bear himself because nobody else had guts enough to wrestle the bear during the North American tour. But when he finally got back to Tennessee, he decided to use her in his own territory. He had some of the other wrestlers that would finally wrestle her. They agreed to, the bear wasn't really tamed with everybody else. I mean, she was horrified of Roy, and she almost killed my father. I'm lucky to even be here. My father got attacked by her at 12 years old, and she darn near killed him. Roy hadn't been there, wouldn't be me sitting here telling this story. But he kept her for probably in the 1950s. 15 years later, she's still wrestling some matches in the southern part of the United States, and he would take her personally and handle her. He didn't have anybody else that could handle her. But I guess the rest of the story is, Melissa, if I had a chance to ask Roy another question, the one question I didn't ask him is what he did with her. How did she die? And I wished I had asked him that. But I think I have a good idea. Knowing Roy and how he felt about his bear, I'll bet you that he found her a really nice zoo someplace where they took real good care of her. And that was probably one of the very first wrestling bears in the history, period. And wow. I'd given anything to see one of her matches, to watch one of her matches. And I've wrestled a bear with my father one time, Morristown, Tennessee. And maybe someday we'll tell that story. But Melissa, the question I would ask was how did Ginger die? And I'm pretty darn sure he took very great care of her right up till she got old, and then he probably put her into a zoo somewhere that took great care of her afterward.
Our next question is from Scott Vandergrift, Knoxville, Tennessee. What did you think of Reggie Parks' belts compared to the old trophy or casted, sometimes junk belts? Or did you give no thought to the belt and see it as only a prop? Also, what are your thoughts on Reggie as a wrestler, booker, and did you work with him?
Another great question. Wow. Belts are the hottest thing in wrestling today, I believe. You know, I never dreamed that wrestling belts would be as popular as they are today. And it's not just at wrestling matches, and it's not just wrestling fans. You see it everywhere. You see it, people that carry belts around that don't have anything to do with wrestling. And Reggie Parks. Well, I guess I'll start back at the beginning, my first wrestling territory in 1974. I mean, belts were always important in the sport. I didn't consider them to be just a prop. You know, they meant something. They meant something to the fans, but wow, oddly enough, they meant something to the wrestlers too. When you gave a wrestler the belt, you could almost see a difference in his work. You know, it's pretty amazing to me, and I watched it happen so many times. You'd have these great guys that were in your territory, and they'd be doing good, and all of a sudden you said, you're going over tonight and you're going to be the champ. It changed them inside. You got more out of a wrestler when he was champion than you ever did with him, and that was really a strange thing, but that's what I realized with as far as belts were concerned. So I never had, all the years I had great belts. You know, it's kind of like figure and finishes. We had something different. We didn't want to just have an old and average belt like everybody else, and we had the crown belts, so we had all different types of belts. But I never discovered Reggie Parks until I got to USA Wrestling in 1988, the last wrestling company I started. And somebody told me, they said, Ron, you need to have Reggie Parks make your belts. And I had heard the Reggie Parks name because he was a wrestler, and I guess he had booked for some people, and he was a name in wrestling, but I never realized he made wrestling belts. So when I started USA Wrestling in 1988, I found Reggie Parks, and I said, make me a USA belt. Wow. This is it. This is one of them. He made me 3 belts. He made me this one, and he made me 2 USA tag team belts. The day this one got delivered to my home, I opened the box and almost fell on the floor. I was like, my God, that's the most beautiful belt I have ever seen, you know. And the first thought was, why for 14 years I have been doing this, have I just discovered this guy and his belts? Because this belt is the reason I kept it. It's the only belt I ever kept, and the reason was because it, to me, is one of the finest pieces of art that was ever done by any belt maker anywhere. And as far as ever working, I never actually met Reggie in person. Talked to him over the phone, tell him what I wanted, gave him some ideas, and he just took it from there. He blew me away, and obviously, if I'd ever continued in the profession and had another wrestling company after USA Wrestling, it would have definitely been with the Reggie Parks belt. They'd have been wearing the champions, the Reggie Parks belt, that's for sure. But I never got to meet Reggie. I never got to wrestle against Reggie. I spoke with him on the phone several times. My father was a friend of him, but my dad never mentioned to me that Reggie Parks made belts. So that's a great question, though. Reggie Parks, and obviously, in my opinion, the greatest wrestling belt maker in the history of wrestling. And I don't know what I would ask for this belt. To me, it's priceless. And I think anybody that has one of those Reggie Park belts, you get a look at it. I don't care who you are and what kind of belt you've got and who made it for you or whatever. I'll guarantee you what you have is not what he makes. And great question.
Our next question comes from Paul Skivers from Dover, Delaware. Ron, which decade do you feel was the most successful for your promotions, the 1970s or 1980s, and why?
Another great question. I never really pondered that very much. From Delaware, over Delaware. All right. Give me just a second here. Well, let's break it down. Southeastern, my first territory, I started in 1974, and it went to 1985. Southeastern Wrestling had two territories during a couple of years there, 78, 79. And those territories were in Gulf Coast, down the Gulf Coast, and there was one in Knoxville. And then in the 80s, it was totally different. Southeastern was still going on in the early 80s, and then it turned into Continental, and it became USA Wrestling. So that's a fairly difficult question to answer, honestly. I really believe the 70s was a tremendous decade for me, from 74 to 79. 79 ended up very hard for me. And we're talking about that now in today's Studcast, man. It's the most difficult year in my career. A lot of negative things happened in 79. Probably, I guess, took a lot of the shine off of what happened in the 1970s. We had great success in the 1970s. Introduced ourselves in the southern United States to a lot of great talent from all over the world, out of Canada and out of England and from here and there and all over. But I'd have to say, honestly, to me, the 1980s was, I think the 1980s was maybe the best decade in the history of wrestling everywhere, not just in my territories, but everywhere. Until, Vince came along toward the end of the 1980s and kind of changed everything, and not in a good way, I have to add. But the 1980s, the early 1980s were just magnificent. Wow, we just had so many great wrestlers come through. But at that point, we solidified the Southeastern Territory into one territory, went back to the Gulf Coast, expanded to Birmingham, expanded back to Knoxville, expanded back into Kentucky. In the 1980s, we actually ran one territory from almost Ohio to the Gulf of Mexico. Had a tremendous operation. We had great wrestling talent. Guys from all over the world, like Adrian Street, that we had a little earlier in this question and answer show. We had tremendous talent back in the 80s. And what we did have that really made the difference to me, though, was our television production. Once we took our television program out of the studio in 1985, we were doing them in Dothan, Alabama, and started doing them live from that 7,000-8,000 crowd Birmingham Monday night thing. Gordon Sully doing the commentary, shooting with 5 cameras. Wow, we had the biggest and the best. We were the first company to do it in a big building outside a studio, and it was just phenomenal. So I would have to say, honestly, that for me, the 80s were just tremendous. It just got better every year. And I think it got better every year for all the promoters all across the country. Wrestling was really on fire in the 1980s. There was great talent everywhere. But Southeastern, we were loaded. We were loaded with it, and we were going back. We went back into Knoxville after we went out of there dead in 1980. That territory, Knoxville, was a tremendous wrestling city. It never drew 1,000 people to a match for 5 straight years, from 1980 to 1985, and we went back there in 1985 with the Tennessee Homecoming. First event in the Coliseum, sold out every event in the Coliseum for 2 years after that. It was a great time. 1980s, I'd have to say the answer to your question, sir, is for me, the 1980s was our zenith, and I just wish that we could have kept going. I think we'd have probably come up with a lot more ideas. We would have probably maybe done even better. Expanded Southeastern, expanded Continental it had become at that point. Continental, I think, would have probably ended up in Florida. the whole state, because Florida was really struggling, and I think we could have grown significantly and become a huge entity. Maybe even getting the national television, who knows, at some point. But the 1980 was a tremendous decade for wrestling, period, and it was a great one for Southeastern, for Continental, and for USA.
The next question comes from Mike Shaper, Dothan, Alabama. Ron, there were some great tag teams back in the territory days. Who do you consider the best of CWF and why?
Jeez, great question, sir. And you're asking about CWF, that's Championship Wrestling from Florida. I was there from early 70s, 1970 to about 1974, and I would have to say for the Championship Wrestling in Florida tag team that was the best during the time I was there. It was Jerry Brown and Buddy Roberts, managed by Sir Oliver Humperdinck. And those guys were champion in 1974 for most of the year. They wrestled against me and Bill Watts and me and other combinations and all kinds of combinations. Nobody seemed to be able to beat that team. And I would have to say for me, especially in the early 70s, it would have to be Buddy Roberts and Jerry Brown and Oliver Humperdinck. But let's expand that a little bit, and let's take it to Southeastern Wrestling. Let's back up to Knoxville days. Southeastern Knoxville had some great tag teams, and one of them that to me was one of the best held the belts there in 1978 for most of the entire year. And that was Dennis Condrey and Phil Hickerson, and they were managed by old Ron Wright. And wow, those boys were good in the ring. My gosh, they were a great team, and you couldn't have a better manager than Ron Wright to me. He was one of the greatest managers of all time, and he got so much heat for those guys, and they got all the rest of it by just being magnificent in the ring. Let's talk about Southeastern and jump on into the 80s, down in Pensacola, Southeastern Gulf Coast down there. Great tag teams. I think the greatest of the whole group, or some of that time frame there, was the first Midnight Express. And gosh, there's been all kinds of combinations of Midnight Express, but to me, the original Midnight Express, first tag team, three-man tag team, just about in wrestling, and that was Dennis Condrey, Randy Rose, and Norvell Austin. And wow, what a combination they made, and it was a unique whole concept. You never knew which two guys you were going to be wrestling. It was a great idea. Those three guys did it just as good as any of them, for darn sure. And then later on, when you got to Continental Wrestling in the mid '80s and other ones, I would have to say early '80s, another great team was Bob and Brad Armstrong. They were just amazing together. Wow, I mean, the father, son, and Brad was just tremendous. Wow, he was great. He was a Rookie of the Year and NWA Rookie of the Year. His daddy was NWA Rookie of the Year about 20 years before that. And wow, what a great combination they were. And another one that I can't deny that was just absolutely wonderful was Jerry Stubbs and Arn Anderson. A tremendous team. Both of those guys could wrestle their rear ends off, and wow, they wrestled all different types of combinations, held the belts for a long time. Tag team wrestling in the South has always been big. There were some territories, like the Memphis territory, that was built on tag team wrestling. We didn't make it the highlight of everything in my promotion, because we had so many great wrestlers and so much talent, and so many great single wrestlers. So, tag teams were a part of it. There was a tag team match every night in every town for sure, sometimes more than one. But, wow, tag team wrestling was great. Championship Wrestling from Florida, sir, the answer there is Buddy Roberts, Jerry Brown, and wow, Looking back on it, I think we probably had some of the greatest tag teams there were in the world during that course of time. Some from 1974 through 1988. I think we had as good a teams as anywhere in the world.
Our next question is from Scott Danoon, Mechanicsville, Virginia. You wrestled all over the country, but not for Mid-Atlantic, the Crockett territory. Why was that, since several Crockett guys would wrestle for you on occasions?
Oh, good question, sir. Out of Virginia. The reason that I didn't wrestle for Crockett is pretty much the same reason I didn't wrestle for a lot of other territories. Once I started my own company in 1974 in Knoxville, in the Southeastern, I wanted to wrestle for myself. And in order to be able to work somebody else's territory, you had to go be in that territory, and you had to live in that territory, and you had to work those towns in that territory every night. And I had a company to run, and I tried to stay on top of that, and I tried to run a great company, and I tried to find the best wrestlers I could, and that's a full-time job. So trying to wrestle for my own companies and trying to wrestle for somebody else's company would have been absolutely impossible. It'd be kind of like trying to be the world champion and have your own company that you had to be responsible for. So, it just didn't, I couldn't be two places at one time, and I preferred to wrestle for myself as much as I could. I felt like I helped the card. And then the reason that I had a couple of guys from Carolina, and I only asked Jim Crockett Sr. one time, early, I think probably 1975, one of the first Coliseum shows I ran, if I could have a couple of guys out of Carolina. And he sent me Ric Flair and Ken Patera. Both those guys were young. What a great match they had in Knoxville. There was really no overlap between the Carolina TVs and my TVs in Tennessee. So I was really, really surprised to see how well that match went over, because most fans didn't know who these two guys were, but they had a phenomenal match. Rick was on his way to being world champion. Ken Patera was a tremendous athlete. Like I said earlier, I wanted to work for myself, and I had no need to have a lot of other wrestlers. We seemed to be loaded with talent. We were really, really lucky. We had some of the greatest wrestlers in the world all the time, and we were able to grow our companies and make them successful. And but it's a great question, though, sir. I would have liked to have worked if I was going to work a territory. It would have probably been Jim Crockett's Mid-Atlantic.
Our next question comes from Paul Bruschi of Gulf Breeze, Florida. How were the boundaries between territories determined and enforced? Did the NWA regulate this? Did conflicts arise between Southeastern and Mid-South or CWF?
Well, another great question, man. We're getting some great questions in this show. Super question. There weren't a lot of disputes, to be quite honest with you. The NWA promoters were all happy to be a part of the organization. They didn't step on other promoters' toes. Everybody was doing well. If you were an NWA promoter, you were probably making pretty good money, man. In the 70s, the 80s, during my time frame, there wasn't a lot of disputes, and there were situations like the one in Atlanta where a particular company in a particular state might have had a problem. In my case, in 1979, I had a war with some of the talent that had been working for me for years. But it didn't happen on a basis that was very often, that's for sure. Let's talk about the Mid-South. Did I ever have any problems with Mid-South? No, I didn't. As a matter of fact, the couple of times that I asked for somebody out of Mid-South, though, and Bill Watts was a personal friend of mine, had been for many years. Bill would have given me anybody I wanted. I wanted to have Ernie Ladd work for me in Dothan, Alabama and Mobile, Alabama, because Watts' TV out of Biloxi overlapped with my TV out of Mobile. I knew that that Ernie Ladd would be a huge star in Mobile, and he was. We do an absolute, I'm just about an all-time record crowd. I wrestled Ernie Ladd in Mobile, Alabama, a big, big crowd. Florida's relationship was even better than Mid-South's relationship. Florida's relationship was so good that in 1982, they had their own building in Tallahassee, Florida, called their sports stadium, in Tallahassee Sports Stadium. And the business had fallen off. They were struggling in 1982, and they called me up, Eddie Graham and my dad, had a conversation with me, and they said, "Kid, would you like to run Tallahassee and use our building, and we'll split the money with you, the profit with you." And so we did. We went in there in '82, and we did a little business in '82. We went back later on though and did some big business in Tallahassee building. We finally got it off the ground and rolling form pretty darn good. But our relationship, and it was kind of like that with all the promoters of the NWA. Guys respected each other. They were all doing good. There was no reason for them to want to jump out of their territory and into somebody else's territory. And to be quite honest with you, during the time that Sam Mutchik was in, the president of the National Wrestling Alliance, I don't think anybody had the guts to even try to pull something like that off. It just wasn't going to happen. It was a pretty cohesive group, the National Wrestling Alliance. All that promoters in that company was well run, and but that's a great question, and I really appreciate that. And I used to live in Gulf Breeze. I love that city. Great place, right across the bay from Pensacola, and thank you for that question, sir.
Our next question is from Fred Edelman from Greensboro, Indiana. Obviously, you and your brother Robert were both great bookers. What would you say were the biggest differences in your booking styles?
Well, great question. An Indiana question. Glad to hear from you out there out of Greensboro, Indiana. Thank you very much, sir, for your question. Well, we had different styles, I think, in so many different ways, my brother and I. Maybe that's why we had so much argument over who was the real Tennessee stud, you know. I mean, everything we did was had a little controversy in it. And I guess the biggest difference between my style of booking and my brother's style was Rob liked to have he liked to have bloody matches. You know, he liked to give his fans the Mongolian Stomper Joe the Duke type of match, in which both of them are bloody as heck and the crowd's going crazy, and you know, and it's kind of hard to follow that match night after night. You know, Rob ended up bleeding a whole lot himself. You know, it was just his style of booking to have those type of matches, and there was nothing wrong with it. Certainly nothing wrong with it. And he was always very successful. He had great crews, and they did good business. So I can't say that there was anything wrong with it. My style of booking, though, was a little bit different. I always like to have, and I think it's because of my brother and I started out together wrestling in Georgia, and for the first 6 months we wrestled in Georgia. Rob went to Tennessee, and I went south to Florida when we split up there, and we were both green, and I ended up in a wrestling territory. I mean, gosh, it was loaded. Florida was down there. It was the Snake Pit. You had the Bob Roops, the Jack Briscoes, the Hiro Matsudas. You had all these shooters. And you know, and I was young, and I got right into that Snake Pit thing, and it set the tone for me for the rest of my life as a booker. I always wanted those great wrestlers, and I wanted to have great wrestling matches. I always loved it when I could put two baby faces together and go out there and watch that match and see the crowd, the fans loving it just as much as one of those big bloody matches. And after all, the word on the marquee out there said wrestling, and so I like to give them the wrestling matches. I went to Knoxville in 1974. That territory was a blood and guts territory. It was just like what Rob would have liked to have run back in those days. Had the Ron Wright and the Whitey Caldwells and the chain matches and all of that. And I brought in Dale Lewis, and I had him wrestle guys out of the crowd, and and I had intentionally booked a lot of just pure wrestling matches so that I could change the mindset of that audience in that part of the country, and go more mainstream. I don't think that people that that watch TV and that just didn't want to see all of that, and so I tried to bring in wrestlers. I brought in Adrian Street, Tony Charles, a lot of guys that did a lot of wrestling. It was just part of their matches, and you knew what you were going to get from them night after night, and that's what we got. So, but that's a great question. I mean, I never really sat and thought about it, but Rob did tend to have the blood and guts, and I tend to have the just downright wrestling. As much of it as I could get, and and there's two very distinctive styles there between bookers, that's for darn sure. But I think we had such good wrestlers. So many guys that could wrestle, and so many guys that if you want to have a bloody match, they could sure give you that. That it really didn't make any difference. We had the right talent, and we couldn't go wrong. When you had the right guys in your crew, you could be a lousy booker and still draw big houses, because those guys would go out there every night and have those people standing up.
Our next question is from Edward Dalton, Dublin, Ireland. A big fan, love your streaming channel, especially the old school TV shows. Surprised to see United Kingdom stars Tony Charles and Adrian Street. How did you find these two, and what made you think they'd be popular in the States?
That's great, man. Dublin, Ireland. Thank you very much for your question, sir. We got fans all over the world. It's pretty amazing. We got a lot of fans in Japan and Canada, a lot of different parts of the world. And thank you very much for that question. And that's a very good question. How in the heck did Southeastern wrestling end up with guys like Tony Charles and Adrian Street? And to be quite honest with you, I never went looking for talent over there. I wrestled a lot of places all over the world. Never got over into Europe. Never got there. But actually, both of these guys that you mentioned contacted me, which was really, I don't know how they decided that they wanted to come to Southeastern or even heard about me and heard about our company, but obviously Tony Charles was the first to come out of the England area, and he was, he was so good, man. I mean, and I had never actually seen him wrestle before, so I was taking a chance, but I talked to a few guys that I knew, and I said, what do you know about Tony Charles? And everybody was like, wow, you got a chance to get Tony Charles, you get him. And so Tony just to set things on fire, man, in Knoxville, and he went on to Pensacola and just did it down there as well. Fell in love with Pensacola, bought himself a house on the beach, and stayed there the rest of his life. God bless him. And wow, what a great guy he was. Adrian Street was another one that contacted me, and he sent me a video. And I've told this story a few times. I took it into Dothan TV one day, and I had a guy put it up on that, and it was a director was there, and normal upstairs, a production crew was there, and I said, put this tape on, man, and let me see this. And here he came with him singing his song and his garb and all his stuff. And I was like, whoa, wait a minute. And, I was about to say, I don't know, man, this guy's pretty far out there. And then he got in the ring and they rang the bell. And I watched 2 minutes of it and I said, I want this guy because he can wrestle. And by golly, he certainly could, man. And wow, he was one of the greatest guys I ever brought into my company. He was extremely talented, same as Tony Charles. I think Adrian's a little better talker than Tony was, a little better on the microphone. But wow, those two guys from that part of the world, it gave us legitimacy, and it gave us a grander scope, and people looked at our companies differently because we had people from other parts of the world. We always had Japanese wrestlers, and we had the headhunters, and from all over the world. But those two guys personally, man, did so much for Southeastern, so much for Continental. It was amazing. Greatest decisions ever made, man, to get my hands on those two guys. It was a real coup for the companies of Southeastern and Continental, for darn sure. Wow, it's just been a great show. Just really, really appreciate all these questions that we've had today. That it's just been so good. I'm amazed at how knowledgeable our wrestling fans are out there. We got a little bit from everybody all over the southern United States and the eastern part of America for sure. We even got somebody from Ireland send us one in this one. And thank you all very, very much for your questions. Before we get to the next one, I just want to remind everybody that I'm going to be putting stuff on my social media sites, all three of the Facebook sites, my Twitter, about the next one, and your questions. If you want to send a question in, please do. Wow, the questions have been great. And you can send them at any time, but you'll see these posts that will start arriving probably 2 weeks prior to the next one. And the next one, by the way, will be again on a Saturday. It's going to be the third Saturday in March. It'll be on March the 18th. And please, you see this post out there for advertising it, and I'll always say that you can leave your question and answer there. Please leave them, and I like to remind everybody, don't just put your question there, but put the place where you live as well, because I like to recognize the parts of the country that you come from. And thank you all so much for this, and for following us, and for supporting us. And well, we had a tremendous viewing audience on the first one, and I hope we can duplicate that, maybe even do any more even on the second one. And thank you all so much for this opportunity, and thank you for joining us here on the YouTube channel, and look forward to seeing you again.